Wyoming Territory, 1873. The silence was the first thing a man noticed and the last thing he ever forgot. It was a physical presence out here, a weight in the air that pressed down on the vast, empty plains and settled deep in the canyons. Ethan Cole had made a kind of peace with it. He had courted it, in fact, building his ranch miles from the nearest neighbor, a solitary outpost against the endless roll of sagebrush and sky. The silence was honest. It made no promises it could not keep and told no lies. It was a better companion than most men. He stood at the edge of his property, the worn leather of his gloves creaking as he tightened a strand of wire around a newly set fence post. The sun was a hot hand on the back of his neck, and the wind, a constant, dry whisper, carried the scent of pine from the distant mountains and the dust of the valley floor. His movements were spare and efficient, honed by years of solitude. There was no one to impress, no one to hurry for. There was only the work, the land, and the silence. It was a simple trinity, and, for a long time, it had been enough. His world was one of textures and muted colors. The rough bark of the cottonwoods lining the creek, the pale green of the sage, the deep, bruised purple of the mountains at dusk. He knew the call of the hawk and the track of the coyote. This land was a harsh master, but it was a fair one. It demanded everything a man had, his sweat, his strength, his vigilance. And in return, it offered a stark and brutal kind of freedom. It was a life he had chosen, or perhaps a life that had chosen him after the war had scoured away everything else. He had come back from the battlefields of the East to a home that was no longer a home, to a silence far more profound and terrible than the one he now inhabited. The quiet of his small farm in Ohio had been filled with the ghosts of a woman's laughter and a child's cry. He had sold the land for pennies on the dollar and ridden west until the memories were just faint echoes, drowned out by the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the territory. Here, he had built a new life, a fortress of self-reliance, its walls constructed of hard labor and emotional distance. He believed attachments were a weakness, a door left unlocked for grief to walk through. He had locked that door and thrown away the key. Then, a sound cut through the stillness, a mournful cry that did not belong to the natural world. The distant whistle of the twice-weekly train, slicing through the afternoon haze. It was a sound he usually ignored, a faint intrusion from a world he had purposefully abandoned. It spoke of cities and crowds, of complications and connections he wanted no part of. But today, the sound lingered in the air, seeming to vibrate with a strange and unfamiliar resonance. It felt like a premonition, a stone dropped into the placid, deep water of his solitude, the ripples spreading outward, unstoppable and unknown. He paused, his hand resting on the fence post, and listened until the sound faded, leaving the silence deeper and more profound than before. A flicker of unease, unwelcome and unfamiliar, stirred within him. He dismissed it with a shake of his head and returned to his work, his movements a little tighter, a little more deliberate, as if reinforcing the defenses of his carefully constructed world. The next day, the need for supplies drove him from his sanctuary. His horse, Apollo, a stoic buckskin gelding, kicked up puffs of golden dust as they made the long ride into Redemption Gulch. The town was little more than a single, wide street carved from the wilderness, a collection of raw timber buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vastness surrounding them. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a sheriff's office, and a small, hopeful church. It was a place of transit, a temporary stop for people heading somewhere else, somewhere better. For Ethan, it was a necessary inconvenience. He tethered Apollo in front of the general store, the leather of the reins smooth and familiar in his hand. The town was quiet in the midday heat. A few men lingered on the boardwalk in front of the saloon, their voices a low murmur. He nodded curtly to Sheriff Jebediah, an older man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose silver badge was tarnished with the dust of 1,000 lonely days. Jebediah was one of the few men Ethan respected, a man who understood the value of leaving others to their own business. As he stepped onto the boardwalk, the train whistle sounded again, much closer this time. A plume of black smoke rose above the squat shape of the water tower at the end of the street. The arrival of the train was the town's main event, a brief connection to the outside world. Usually, Ethan conducted his business and was gone long before it arrived. Today, his timing was off. He felt that same flicker of unease from the day before, a sense of something being out of place. He entered the cool, shadowed interior of the general store, the air thick with the scents of coffee beans, cured leather, and dried lavender. He gave his list to Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man whose round spectacles always seemed to be perched on the very end of his nose. As Henderson gathered the flour, salt, and cartridges, Ethan found his gaze drifting to the window. He could see the train pulling into the small station, its brakes hissing like a great iron serpent. A handful of people disembarked. A pair of drummers in dusty suits, a family with too many children and not enough luggage, a few rough-looking men heading for the gold fields further north. And then her. She was the last one off the passenger car, and she stood on the platform as if she had stepped out of a different world entirely. Her dress was the color of a summer sky, finely made but creased and dusted with the grime of a long journey. A matching bonnet framed a face that was pale with exhaustion, but her posture held a straight-backed dignity that defied her surroundings. Honey blonde hair had escaped the confines of her bonnet, catching the harsh sunlight like spun gold. She clutched a small, elegant valise and scanned the platform, her eyes filled with a hopeful anticipation that slowly, painfully, began to curdle into uncertainty. Ethan watched, a detached observer. He had seen women like her before, eastern birds with bright plumage, lured west by promises that turned to dust as soon as they arrived. They rarely lasted. The land was too hard, the life too unforgiving. She looked fragile, like a piece of fine porcelain set down in a blacksmith shop. He felt a brief, distant pang of pity and then turned his attention back to his supplies. It was not his concern. He paid Henderson, packed his goods into his saddlebags, and was about to leave when he saw her still standing there. The train had departed, its whistle a fading cry on the wind. The small crowd had dispersed. She was alone now, a solitary, blue-clad figure on the empty platform, looking utterly and completely lost. Silas, the grizzled station master, was talking to her, gesticulating with a calloused hand. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the slump of her shoulders as her last hope evaporated. Against his better judgment, he found himself walking toward the station. He told himself it was just curiosity, a momentary diversion. As he drew closer, he could hear their conversation. "A Mr. Abernathy, you say?" Silas was saying, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Ma'am, Percival Abernathy lit out of here 2 days ago. Said he was heading for California. Didn't mention he was expecting anyone." The woman's face, already pale, lost its last trace of color. "But he sent me the ticket. He wrote of a house, a position as a governess for his sister's children." Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Ma'am, Abernathy ain't got a sister any more than he's got a conscience. He's a swindler. My guess is he took whatever money you sent him for preparations and vanished." Her composure, so carefully maintained, finally began to crack. Her chin trembled, but she did not cry. She simply stood there, absorbing the devastating truth, the vast, empty landscape behind her, a perfect mirror for the desolation in her eyes. It was then that a sudden, fierce gust of wind swept down the street, a precursor to the afternoon storms that often rolled off the mountains. It kicked up a blinding swirl of dust and grit. She took an involuntary step back, stumbling on the uneven edge of the platform. Ethan didn't think. He simply moved. In 2 long strides, he was there, his hand shooting out to grip her arm, steadying her before she could fall. The fabric of her sleeve was fine and soft beneath his calloused fingers. Her skin was warm. The contact was a shock to his system, a jolt of unexpected connection in a life defined by its absence. She looked up at him, her eyes the color of a stormy sea, wide with surprise and fear. For a moment, they just stood there, his hand on her arm, the wind whipping her loose strands of hair across his face, the dust swirling around them like golden phantoms. In that instant, he knew the ripples from that stone had finally reached the shore of his quiet life. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. She pulled her arm away, and the loss of contact was as jarring as the connection had been. Ethan cleared his throat, feeling awkward and exposed. "You should get out of the wind," he said, his own voice sounding rough and unfamiliar. He had intended to walk away, to leave her to her fate, but the words came out instead. The walls of his fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a simple, reflexive act of kindness. Sheriff Jebediah had seen the whole exchange from his office. He ambled over, his spurs ringing softly on the boardwalk. "Problem here, Ethan?" he asked, his eyes taking in the woman's predicament with a practiced, weary gaze. "She was expecting a man who isn't here," Ethan stated flatly, already regretting his involvement. The woman, Clara Mae Thompson, as she introduced herself, explained her situation to the sheriff with a quiet, desperate dignity. Jebediah listened patiently, his expression grim. "Abernathy," he sighed, shaking his head. "We should have run him out of town weeks ago. Ma'am, the only boarding house is full up with surveyors for the railroad. And the saloon? Well, that's no place for you." An uncomfortable silence fell. Clara stood before them, a castaway on a dusty shore, with no funds for a ticket back east and nowhere to go. The town of Redemption Gulch, for all its hopeful name, offered her none. It was Jebediah who voiced the unthinkable. "Ethan," he said, turning to him, "you got that spare room, and Martha goes out twice a week to clean for you. She could stay on for a few days, act as a chaperone, just until we can figure something out. Until the next train." Ethan stared at him, horrified. His ranch? His sanctuary? The very idea was a violation. He wanted to refuse, to list all the reasons it was impossible. His home was no place for a woman, especially not a refined one from the East. It was stark, functional, devoid of comfort. He was a solitary man and used a company. The words of refusal were on his tongue, but then he looked at Clara. He saw the sheer terror she was trying so hard to conceal, the exhaustion etched into the fine lines around her eyes, and the stubborn pride that kept her from begging. He saw not a delicate flower, but a person fighting a desperate battle for survival. And in her eyes, he saw a reflection of the same loneliness he knew so well. Just until the next train, he heard himself say, the words tasting like surrender. He cursed himself for his weakness, for this uncharacteristic lapse in his carefully maintained detachment. He was offering shelter to a stranger, letting the outside world into the one place he had ever felt safe. Clara looked at him, her expression a mixture of profound relief and wary uncertainty. I couldn't possibly impose. I can pay for my keep. I can work. There's no need," Ethan said gruffly, already turning toward his horse. "Get your things." The ride to the ranch was conducted in a strained silence. Clara sat astride a gentle mare borrowed from the sheriff's stable, her posture stiff and uncertain. She had never been on a horse before, and the alien motion, combined with the overwhelming scale of the landscape, left her feeling small and insignificant. The mountains loomed like jagged teeth against the horizon, and the sky was a vast, indifferent blue. It was beautiful, she supposed, but it was a beauty that held a threat, a wildness that felt utterly untamable. Ethan rode, slightly ahead, a silent, imposing figure. His back was ramrod straight, his attention fixed on the trail ahead. He felt her presence behind him like a weight, a disruption to the familiar rhythm of his life. Every rustle of her dress, every nervous shift in her saddle, was an intrusion. He was acutely aware of her vulnerability, and it made him angry. He was angry at Abernathy for his cruelty, at the town for its lack of options, and most of all, at himself for being unable to simply turn his back. When they finally crested a ridge and his ranch came into view, he heard her draw a small, sharp breath. The house was a simple, sturdy structure of hewn logs, nestled in a small valley beside a winding creek lined with cottonwoods. A corral, a barn, and a few outbuildings stood nearby. It was a place of stark functionality, built for survival, not comfort. There were no flowers, no curtains in the windows, no sign of softening touch. It was the physical manifestation of the man who lived there, solid, isolated, and unadorned. He helped her dismount, his hands briefly spanning her waist. The contact was again unsettling, a fleeting moment of intimacy that felt more profound than it should have. He led her inside. Clara stood in the center of the room, her valise at her feet, looking small and out of place. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her exhaustion. "I am in your debt. I will not be a burden. I will earn my keep until I can make other arrangements." He just nodded, unable to meet her gaze, and retreated to the barn, to the familiar comfort of his chores. But the silence of his home was no longer his own. It was now shared, and the knowledge of her presence in the room upstairs was a constant, unnerving hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. The next few days passed in a state of strained cohabitation. Martha, a kind, bustling woman with warm eyes, arrived as promised. She took Clara under her wing, clucking with sympathy over her situation and showing her the workings of the house. Clara, true to her word, was not a burden. She insisted on helping, her hands, though uncalloused, proving to be quick and capable. She mended Ethan's worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned to knead dough for bread, to tend the small vegetable patch behind the house. She moved through his home with a quiet grace that was both a comfort and a disturbance. Ethan kept his distance. He rose before dawn and returned after dusk, filling his days with the most arduous tasks he could find, hoping to exhaust himself into a state of numbness. He ate his meals in terse silence, answering her polite questions with monosyllabic replies. He was a sentry guarding the borders of his own heart, and he saw her as a potential invader. Yet, he found himself watching her. He watched her from the barn as she hung laundry on the line, the white sheets brilliant against the blue sky, her honey-blonde hair escaping its pins in the breeze. He watched her in the evenings as she sat by the fire, reading one of the few books he owned, her face softened by the flickering light. He noticed the way she spoke to his horse, her voice gentle and soothing. He saw a strength in her, a resilience he hadn't expected. She was not the fragile piece of porcelain he had first imagined. She was more like a wildflower that had taken root in rocky soil, determined to bloom against the odds. One evening, a summer storm rolled in with sudden violence. The sky turned a dark, bruised gray, and the wind howled around the corners of the log house like a hungry wolf. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the small home. They were trapped inside, the storm enforcing a proximity that Ethan had been trying so hard to avoid. They sat in the main room, the only light coming from the fire crackling in the hearth. The roar of the storm outside made conversation impossible, but when it finally settled into a steady, drumming rain, the silence inside became immense, charged with unspoken thoughts. It was Clara who broke it. "Does it storm like this often?" she asked, her voice soft. "Often enough," he replied, his gaze fixed on the flames. Another silence stretched between them. He could feel her looking at him, could feel the weight of her unspoken questions. He braced himself for them, for the inevitable inquiries into his life that he would have to deflect. But her next question surprised him. What was her name? He stiffened, turning to look at her. Her expression was not one of idle curiosity, but of a deep, quiet empathy. She gestured vaguely to the room, to the stark emptiness of it. "This house feels like it's holding its breath. It feels like it's waiting for someone who isn't coming back." His first instinct was to shut her down, to tell her it was none of her business. But the storm had rattled something loose inside him, and her perception was so unnervingly accurate that it disarmed him. The words came out before he could stop them, rough and coated in the dust of disuse. "Sarah," he said. The name felt strange on his tongue. Her name was Sarah, and our son was Daniel. He hadn't spoken their names aloud to another soul in years. Saying them now felt like opening a wound, but also, strangely, like a release of pressure. He found himself telling her, the story spilling out in clipped, painful sentences. He told her of the farm in Ohio, of marrying his childhood sweetheart, of the son who had his mother's bright smile. He told her about the war, about the letters he sent and the ones he received, until they stopped coming. He told her of his return, walking up the lane to a house that was too quiet, of a neighbor who told him the fever had taken them both within a week of each other. He had been a month too late. He spoke of the emptiness, the rage, the grief that had hollowed him out. He told her why he had come west, to a place so big and empty that his own private emptiness might not seem so significant. When he finished, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the steady drumming of the rain. He felt raw, exposed, as if he had stripped off a layer of skin. Clara didn't offer platitudes or empty words of comfort. She simply listened, and when he was done, she reached across the small space between them and laid her hand on his arm, the same way he had grabbed hers on the station platform. It was a gesture of pure, unadorned compassion. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered. Then she told him of her own losses. Her parents, a kind, scholarly father, and a warm-hearted mother, taken by influenza the winter before. She spoke of the loneliness of their big Boston house, of the predatory relatives who saw her as a burden, of the cloying pity of her friends. Abernathy's letters, with their eloquent descriptions of a new life and a loving family, had been a lifeline. She had clung to it with the desperation of a drowning woman, only to find it was a lie. In that small, fire-lit room, surrounded by the storm, two solitary people shared their broken pieces. The chasm between them, once a vast and unbridgeable canyon, had been narrowed to a fragile, trembling bridge of shared understanding. He was no longer just her reluctant protector, and she was no longer just a burden. They were two survivors, each scarred by a different kind of war, who had found a momentary truce in the company of the other. For the first time since she had arrived, Ethan didn't resent her presence. The silence in the house no longer felt like an empty tomb. It felt, instead, like a shared quiet. And it was a quiet he was beginning to realize he did not want to lose. The storm passed, and with it, something of the tension in the house eased. A subtle shift had occurred, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond forged in the firelight. Ethan found himself speaking more, his words no longer clipped and reluctant. He told her about the land, explaining the rhythms of the seasons, the names of the wildflowers that grew by the creek. He showed her how to read the clouds, to predict the weather, a skill as vital as reading a book in this part of the country. Clara, in turn, blossomed under the attention. She was a keen student, her sharp mind soaking up the knowledge he offered. She began to see the landscape not as a threat, but as a complex and beautiful tapestry. She learned the difference between the call of a hawk and an eagle, and she pointed out the delicate beauty of a cactus flower he had never bothered to notice. She was not just adapting, she was thriving. The resilience he had glimpsed in her was proving to be a deep and powerful current. He started to see that her refinement was not a weakness, but a different kind of strength, a strength of spirit and intellect that was just as formidable as his own physical prowess. Their days fell into a comfortable routine. They worked together in the garden, their hands sometimes brushing as they reached for the same tool. They ate their meals with easy conversation, sharing stories of their past lives, which now seemed to belong to two different people. The house began to change, too. A jar of wildflowers appeared on the table. The curtains she had sewn from a bolt of spare calico softened the harsh light in the main room. His stark fortress was slowly, imperceptibly, being transformed into a home. This newfound peace, however, was a fragile thing in a land that did not favor it. The first sign of trouble arrived in Redemption Gulch in the form of two men. They were hard-faced and wore city clothes that looked out of place and uncomfortable. They rode into town on tired horses and went straight to the saloon, where they started asking questions. They were looking for a man named Abernathy, and for a woman, an Easterner with honey blonde hair, who they claimed was his accomplice. Sheriff Jebediah, nursing a cup of coffee at the counter, listened with growing concern. The men claimed that Abernathy had swindled their employer, a wealthy land baron from Chicago, named Silas Blackwood. They said Abernathy had sold Blackwood a deed to a worthless piece of land, but not before stealing a map that supposedly led to a rich silver claim. They were convinced the woman, Clara, had the map. Jebediah knew a lie when he heard one. The story was too elaborate, too convenient. He sent a boy out to Ethan's ranch with a hastily scrawled note, warning him of the new arrivals. Ethan read the note with a cold, knot tightening in his stomach. The world he had tried so hard to keep at bay was now knocking at his door. His immediate instinct was a fierce, primal surge of protectiveness. The thought of those men, with their greedy eyes and false stories, getting anywhere near Clara filled him with a cold rage. He didn't tell her about the note. He saw no reason to frighten her. Instead, he became more vigilant, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge. He cleaned and oiled his rifle, and he kept his Colt revolver holstered at his hip, even while doing chores around the ranch. He found excuses to keep her close, asking for her help with tasks near the house. The two men, a burly one named Finn and a wiry, rat-faced one named Coley, eventually rode out to the ranch. They found Ethan splitting logs by the barn. They tried to be casual, tipping their hats and making small talk about the weather, but their eyes were constantly scanning the property, searching for a glimpse of Clara. "Heard you took an astray, Cole," Finn said, his voice a low rumble. A lady from back east. Ethan didn't stop his work. He brought the axe down with a sharp crack, splitting a log cleanly in two. He straightened up, leaning the axe against the chopping block. His gaze was flat and cold as ice. "The only strays I see are the two in front of me," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a clear threat. "My business is my own. I suggest you remember that," Coley sneered. "We ain't looking for trouble. Just for what's ours. The girl has something that belongs to our boss. The only thing the lady has is my protection," Ethan said. "This is your only warning. Get off my land. And don't come back." There was a moment of tense silence. The two men exchanged a look, weighing their options. They saw the set of Ethan's jaw, the way his hand rested near the butt of his pistol, and the unyielding certainty in his eyes. They were hired thugs, not fools. They turned their horses and rode away, but Ethan knew it wasn't over. Men like that didn't give up easily. They would be back. The confrontation solidified something in his mind. His feelings for Clara were no longer a confusing undercurrent. They were a powerful, undeniable force. The thought of her being harmed was intolerable. He had built his life on the principle of avoiding attachments to avoid pain, but he now realized that the pain of losing her would be far greater than any he had ever known, even greater than the ghosts of his past. The fortress he had built to keep grief out had now become a prison, and he was terrified that its walls were not strong enough to protect the one person who had managed to find her way inside. A few days later, his fears were realized. He had asked Clara to ride out to the north pasture to check on a section of fence he had repaired. He had watched her go, admiring the confident way she now handled the mare. He told himself it was safe. The pasture was in a wide, open valley, visible from the house. He was mending a harness in the barn when a flicker of movement on the far ridge caught his eye. It was Finn and Coley watching the pasture. Watching her, a cold dread seized him. He dropped the harness and sprinted for Apollo, swinging into the saddle without bothering with the reins, guiding the horse with his knees as he pulled his rifle from its scabbard. He urged the buckskin into a frantic gallop, his heart pounding in his chest. Down in the valley, Clara was blissfully unaware. She had found the fence to be secure and was enjoying the warmth of the sun and the peaceful solitude. As she turned the mare to head back, Coley, who had circled around behind a line of rocks, suddenly spurred his horse out into the open, yelling and waving his hat. The mare, a gentle creature, panicked. It shied violently, eyes wide with terror, and bolted. Clara, caught by surprise, lost a stirrup and was thrown off balance, clinging desperately to the reins. The horse was running blind, heading straight for a treacherous, rock-strewn gully. Ethan saw it all happening. He urged Apollo on, the wind tearing at his face. He was shouting her name, but his voice was lost in the thundering of hooves. He saw her struggling to stay on, her face a mask of terror. He saw the gully approaching, a deadly trap of sharp rocks and broken ground. He pushed Apollo to a speed he didn't know the horse possessed, cutting across the valley at a sharp angle to intercept her. He drew alongside the runaway mare, the two horses running neck and neck. "Clara, let go of the reins," he yelled. "Let them go." She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but she trusted him. She released her grip. The mare, free to the bit, began to slow. Ethan reached out, his arm wrapping around her waist, and lifted her bodily from her saddle onto his own, pulling her in front of him. She collapsed against his chest, trembling, her arms clinging to him. He brought Apollo to a halt, his own body shaking with adrenaline and relief. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, the simple, miraculous fact of her safety. The two thugs, seeing their plan had failed, had already vanished back over the ridge. He held her for a long time, the silence of the valley descending around them once more. But this silence was different. It was filled with the frantic beating of their shared hearts. This was the moment his protective instinct solidified into something deeper, something terrifying and absolute. He had almost lost her, and the thought shattered him. The near disaster in the North Pasture had a profound and devastating effect on Ethan. The terror of almost losing Clara, of seeing her life endangered because of her association with him, resurrected all his old demons. The ghosts of Sarah and Daniel, long dormant, rose again, whispering their terrible, cautionary tale. Love, his heart screamed, was a prelude to loss. Attachment was a liability. He had failed to protect his first family. He was terrified he would fail again. His carefully constructed world had been predicated on a single, grim principle. A man alone is a man who can't be hurt by the loss of others. By letting Clara into his life, into his home, he had violated his own sacred rule. The joy and warmth she had brought were, in his panicked mind, merely the bait in a cruel trap set by fate. The incident with the thugs was not just a threat, it was a warning. And so, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He began to rebuild his walls, this time higher and stronger than before, with Clara on the outside. He retreated into a cold, impenetrable silence. The easy conversations over dinner vanished, replaced by a strained quiet. He stopped sharing his knowledge of the land, stopped meeting her eyes. He became the same gruff, distant man she had first met, only now his coldness was laced with a palpable pain that made it all the more cutting. Clara was bewildered and heartbroken. The warmth and connection they had shared, the fragile bridge of understanding they had built, seemed to have been washed away overnight. She tried to understand, to reach him, but her questions were met with terse, evasive answers. "Is something wrong, Ethan?" she would ask. "Did I do something?" "Everything is fine," he would lie, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Just busy." She didn't believe him. She saw the turmoil in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw the way his hands clenched when she entered a room. She felt his withdrawal not as a simple absence of warmth, but as a physical rejection, a deliberate and painful pushing away. She mistook his fear for her safety as a rejection of her person. She began to believe that he had tired of her, that the burden of her presence had finally become too much. Perhaps, she thought with a pang of despair, he was no different from Abernathy after all, just another man eager to be rid of her. The final blow came a few days later. He found her in the garden, tending the small shoots of green that had become her pride. He stood there for a moment, his shadow falling over her. She looked up, her face hopeful, but his expression crushed that hope before he even spoke. "The train comes through on Friday," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "I'll take you into town. Jebediah has arranged for your ticket back to Boston. He wired your cousin. The money will be waiting." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs. Back to Boston? Back to the life of pity and dependence she had fled? He was sending her away. He was casting her out. "I see," she said, her voice a small, tight whisper. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands, her movements stiff and brittle. She would not let him see her cry. Her pride, that stubborn, resilient core of her being, was all she had left. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Cole. I will be ready on Friday." She turned and walked back to the house, her back ramrod straight, each step in agony. Ethan watched her go, his heart feeling as though it were being torn from his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to call her back, to tell her the truth, to confess that he was sending her away not because he wanted her to go, but because he couldn't bear the thought of her staying and being hurt. He was trying to save her, even if it meant destroying himself. But the old fear was stronger. The ghosts of his past were louder. He remained silent, a statue of misery, as the door of the house closed, shutting him out. The 2 days leading up to her departure were an exercise in quiet torture. They moved around each other like ghosts in the house that had so recently felt like a home. The air was thick with unspoken words and misunderstood intentions. Clara packed her small valise, her movements slow and deliberate. She folded the calico curtain she had made and left them on the bed. She took one last walk down to the creek, her heart aching with the beauty of the place she had briefly dared to think of as her own. Ethan was a study in grim determination. He worked himself to the point of exhaustion, trying to numb the gaping wound in his soul. He saw the pain in her eyes, and it was a mirror of his own. This, he told himself, was for the best. She would be safe. She would go back to her world, and he would return to his. The silence would descend once more, and he would learn to bear it, just as he had before. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this new silence would be infinitely heavier, filled now not with the ghosts of a distant past, but with the fresh, vibrant ghost of her. The night before she was to leave, a heavy stillness fell over the ranch. The moon was a sliver in a starless sky. Ethan sat in the dark main room long after Clara had retired to her room, the unlit fireplace a cold, black mouth. He couldn't bring himself to go to bed. Sleep felt like a betrayal, a surrender to the inevitable emptiness of the coming day. He felt a restless urge to patrol, to stand guard one last time. He told himself it was just old habit, but he knew he couldn't bear to be far from her. He slipped out of the house and made his way to a small, rocky outcrop that overlooked the ranch, a vantage point he often used to watch for predators. It was from there that he saw them. 2 shadowy figures on horseback, moving stealthily through the cottonwoods along the creek bed, approaching the house from the rear. Finn and Coley. They were moving with a grim purpose, their desperation making them bold. They must have thought he was in town, or asleep, leaving Clara alone and vulnerable. A surge of pure, cold fury washed through him, burning away his grief and fear. He had tried to send her away to protect her, and his cowardice had led to this, the very danger he had sought to avoid. He scrambled down from the outcrop, his movements silent and swift, his rifle in his hand. There would be no more running, no more pushing away. He would defend his home. He would defend her. Inside the house, Clara couldn't sleep. Her heart was a leaden weight in her chest. She stood by the window of her small room, looking out at the dark landscape. She heard a faint sound from downstairs, a soft scraping noise at the back door. She froze, her blood turning to ice. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was the sound of a lock being forced. Panic seized her for a moment, but then it was replaced by a surge of defiant anger. They had hounded her, threatened her, and now they were invading this place of sanctuary. She would not be a helpless victim. She crept silently out of her room and down the stairs. Peeking around the corner into the main room, she saw the back door swing open. The hulking silhouette of Finn filled the doorway. Just as he stepped inside, the front door burst open and Ethan was there, his rifle already at his shoulder. "Get away from her," he commanded, his voice a low, deadly growl. Finn was startled, but he recovered quickly, drawing his own pistol. At the same moment, Coley appeared at the back door behind him. They had him caught in a crossfire. "Drop it, Cole," Coley sneered. Where the lady gets it first, everything seemed to slow down. Ethan knew he could take one of them, but not both before the other fired. He was trapped. His eyes met Clara's across the shadowed room. He saw not terror, but a fierce, blazing determination. While the men were focused on Ethan, Clara acted. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. It was her only chance. With a silent prayer, she snatched it up. It was heavier than she expected, solid and cold in her hands. As Finn took a step toward Ethan, his attention momentarily diverted, Clara moved. She rushed forward from the shadows, swinging the poker with all her might. The iron connected with the back of Finn's head with a sickening thud. He grunted, his eyes rolling back in his head, and crumpled to the floor in a heap. The diversion was all Ethan needed. As Coley stared in shock at his fallen partner, Ethan's rifle cracked. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Coley cried out, clutching his shoulder as his pistol clattered to the floor. The immediate threat was over. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Coley's pained groans and the ragged sound of their breathing. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Ethan moved swiftly, kicking Coley's gun away and checking on Finn, who was unconscious but breathing. He then turned to Clara. She was standing by the fireplace, the iron poker still clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. She was trembling from head to toe, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the open door. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gently took the poker from her grasp, letting it fall to the floor. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him, his entire body shaking with the aftermath of the fight and the overwhelming, terrifying reality of what he had almost lost. He buried his face in her hair, his carefully constructed walls not just breached, but utterly demolished, reduced to rubble by the force of his love and his fear. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "Clara, I am so sorry." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. The moonlight illuminated the tears shining in her eyes. "I was a fool," he said, his voice thick. "A blind, stubborn fool. Sending you away, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if you were gone, you'd be safe. But I was just protecting myself. From this," he pressed a hand to his chest. "From feeling this. I can't lose you, Clara. I thought the silence in my life was peace, but it was just emptiness. You filled that emptiness. The thought of this house, of my life, going back to the way it was before you came, it's not a life I want to live." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes, all his defenses gone, leaving him completely vulnerable. "I love you," he said, the words a confession and a plea. "Don't go back to Boston. Stay here. With me." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of overwhelming relief and a joy so profound it was painful. She threw her arms around his neck, her answer lost in a sob against his shoulder. He held her, knowing that his life had irrevocably, wonderfully been broken open, and he would never, ever be whole again without her. The fortress of his solitude had fallen, and in its ruins, something beautiful was beginning to grow. By the time Sheriff Jebediah and a small posse arrived, summoned by the sound of the gunshot echoing through the valley, the immediate crisis had passed. Ethan had Coley tied securely to a chair, his shoulder bandaged, and Finn was beginning to stir on the floor. The sight of the disarray in the cabin and Clara's pale, determined face told Jebediah most of the story. Under the sheriff's stern questioning, the wounded Coley, his bravado gone, confessed everything. He admitted that the story about the stolen map was a fabrication concocted by their employer, Blackwood. Abernathy had indeed swindled Blackwood in a land deal, but Clara's only connection was that Abernathy had used her expected arrival as a diversion to cover his own escape from town. Blackwood, a man of immense pride and vengeful nature, had sent Finn and Coley not to retrieve a map, but to retrieve Clara, intending to use her as leverage against Abernathy, or simply to make an example of her. The threat, which had seemed so personal, was revealed to be the callous, impersonal byproduct of greed and ego. With Coley's confession, the external danger that had shadowed them for weeks finally dissolved. Jebediah and his men hauled the 2 thugs away, leaving Ethan and Clara alone in the quiet aftermath. The rising sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks with a delicate pink light, promising a new day. The cabin was a mess, a testament to the violence of the night, but the air felt cleansed, lighter. They stood together in the doorway, watching the posse disappear down the trail. The chaos had stripped away all pretense, all misunderstanding, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their feelings for each other. In the quiet dawn, Ethan turned to her. He took her hands in his touch gentle and reverent. Her fingers were cold, and he chafed them between his palms. "Clara," he began, his voice still hoarse with the emotion of his earlier confession. "What I said last night, I meant every word. My life before you was gray. You brought the color back into it. You brought life back into this house. I don't want to imagine a single day without you in it." He hesitated, the next words feeling momentous, foreign on his tongue. He had never expected to say them to anyone again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn wooden box. He opened it to reveal a simple, slender gold band, its surface worn smooth with time. "This was my mother's," he said softly. "She gave it to me to give to Sarah. After I put it away, I never thought I'd have a reason to look at it again. It's not much. It's not fine or fancy like the things you're used to, but it represents everything I have to offer. A life here with me, a partnership, a home." He looked into her eyes, his own shining with a hope that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Clara May Thompson, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me, here in this wild, beautiful place?" Clara's heart swelled. She looked from the simple ring to the earnest, open face of the man holding it. He was offering her not just his love, but his past, his future, his entire world. He was offering her a home, not of brick and mortar, but of the heart. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with happy tears. "Oh, Ethan." Yes, he slid the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit. He drew her into his arms and kissed her, a kiss that sealed the promises made in the wake of violence and fear. It was a kiss of new beginnings, of futures reclaimed from the ashes of the past. News of the attack and the subsequent proposal spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. Any lingering gossip about the propriety of their living arrangement was burned away, replaced by a wave of communal support and admiration. They had faced down danger together, a story that resonated deeply with the frontier spirit of the town. Clara was no longer seen as a fragile Easterner, but as a woman of courage and grit, the kind of woman who belonged in the West. Ethan, the solitary, grim rancher, was seen in a new light, a man capable of deep love and fierce protection. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the town's small church a week later. The entire town seemed to be in attendance. Martha and Jebediah stood beside them as witnesses. The women of the town had banded together to help Clara fashion a wedding dress from a bolt of fine white cotton from Henderson's store, and they had filled the church with armfuls of wildflowers. The men had organized a collection to help Ethan repair the damage to his cabin. As Clara walked down the short aisle on Sheriff Jebediah's arm, she saw Ethan waiting for her at the altar. He was dressed in a new suit, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable, but his eyes were fixed on her, filled with a love so profound it took her breath away. When she took his hand, his grip was firm and steady, a silent promise of a life they were about to begin. After the ceremony, the town held a celebration in front of the general store. There was music from a fiddler, and tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family. Ethan, who had always stood at the edge of the town's social gatherings, now stood at the center, his arm wrapped securely around his wife. He accepted the slaps on the back and the hearty congratulations with a small, genuine smile. He was no longer just an inhabitant of this place. He was a part of its community. Later that evening, as they rode back to the ranch, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The world seemed fresh and new, washed clean. When they arrived, they found that a group of men from town had already been there, replacing the broken door and patching the bullet holes in the wall. A new, sturdy lock was on the door. Their community had rallied around them, reinforcing their home, just as they had reinforced each other. That night, as Ethan held his wife in his arms in the quiet of their bedroom, he felt a sense of peace he had never known. The silence of the house was no longer empty or haunting. It was a contented quiet, filled with the soft sound of their breathing, the warmth of their shared presence. He had thought love was a weakness, a vulnerability. He now knew it was the greatest strength a man could ever possess. It was the anchor in the storm, the fire in the cold, the thing that made a simple log cabin in the middle of nowhere the very center of the universe. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the valley. The ranch was transformed. The house now had a wide porch running along the front, complete with a sturdy swing that Ethan had built the previous winter. The vegetable garden Clara had started was now a sprawling, thriving plot, bursting with corn, squash, and tomatoes. A riot of wildflowers grew along the fence line, a splash of vibrant color against the muted tones of the landscape. The stark fortress had become a welcoming, vibrant home. A small boy with Ethan's dark, curly hair and Clara's startlingly blue eyes toddled on unsteady legs across the porch, chasing after a wooden horse. He was the spitting image of a son Ethan had lost, but looking at him brought not a pang of grief, but a wave of profound, heart-stopping love. This was Daniel, named for the brother he would never know, a testament not to what was lost, but to what had been found. Clara came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She was pregnant again, her form rounded with the promise of their second child. She watched her son play, a soft smile on her face. The refined woman from Boston had become a confident frontier wife and mother. Her hands were calloused now, her face lightly tanned by the sun, but her eyes held a deep, settled happiness that had never been there before. She saw Ethan riding in from the fields, a familiar silhouette against the setting sun. He rode with an easy confidence, but his eyes were already on the house, on her and their son. As he dismounted, Daniel let out a squeal of delight and ran toward him, his short legs pumping. "Papa!" Ethan swung the boy up into his arms, settling him on his hip. Daniel's small hands immediately went to his father's face, patting his cheek. The stoic, solitary man was gone, replaced by a husband and father whose love was as vast and open as the sky above them. He walked onto the porch and kissed Clara, a deep, lingering kiss that spoke of shared days and quiet nights, of difficulties overcome and joys multiplied. "Good day," she asked, her hand resting on his arm. "The best," he replied, his gaze encompassing her, their son, their home. Later, after Daniel was asleep in his crib upstairs, they sat together on the porch swing, its gentle creak a familiar, comforting rhythm. The day's heat was fading, and a cool breeze whispered through the cottonwoods. A symphony of crickets began to tune up for their nightly performance. The sky was ablaze with the fiery colors of sunset. Ethan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned her head against him, her hand resting on his knee. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains. "I was thinking today," Ethan said softly, his voice a low rumble against her ear, "about the first time I heard the train whistle after you arrived. I remember feeling like something was wrong, like the silence had been broken." Clara smiled. "And now?" He looked out at the vast, darkening landscape, at the first stars beginning to appear in the deep velvet of the sky. He thought of the profound, aching emptiness that had once defined his world. He had sought out the quiet, believing it was a shield, but she had shown him the difference between the silence of loneliness and the quiet of peace. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer, his other hand coming to rest on the gentle swell of her belly, where their new life was growing. "Now," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Now it's just peace.